LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
President Kennedy was shot today just as his motorcade left downtown Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy jumped up and grabbed Mr. Kennedy. She cried, "Oh no." The motorcade sped on. A photographer said he saw blood on the president's head. It was believed 2 shots were fired.
President Kennedy has been shot in Dallas, Texas. He was shot while he was touring town with Governor Connally in the famous bubble car. The bubble was down. 3 shots rang out, and the president slumped forward, and Governor Connally remained seated upright. So far, the latest word is that they are still alive. Mrs. Kennedy, as soon as the president slumped forward, she grabbed him, she cradled him in her arms, and she said, "Oh no," and tried to hold up his head. Then the car was quickly taken out of line and sped to the hospital. The president and the governor were rushed to Parkland Hospital near Dallas, the Dallas trademark, where Mr. Kennedy was to have made a speech.
That the president has died. However, we must emphasize that this report has so far been unconfirmed.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. These details about the same as previously. President Kennedy shot today just as his motorcade left downtown Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy jumped up and grabbed Mr. Kennedy. She called, "Oh no." The motorcade sped on. United Press says that the wounds for President Kennedy perhaps could be fatal.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Farsight Institute Director Courtney Brown, who joins us to discuss their latest remote viewing project, the JFK Assassination. The assassination of US President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963 remains one of the most controversial events in world history. The official story, that Kennedy was killed by a lone gunman acting alone, has been hotly disputed almost from the start. Indeed, along with the Apollo moon missions and the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the JFK assassination has been the popular subject of numerous so-called conspiracy theories, as everyone from serious researchers to outright cranks formulate their own version of the fateful day's events. Having previously used their skills to probe deeper into mysteries such as the existence of extraterrestrial life, the legendary island of Atlantis, and the aforementioned 9/11 attacks, Farsight's remote viewers now turn their attention to JFK's violent demise. Part 1 of the JFK assassination focuses on the assassins themselves, while Part 2 exposes the shadowy figures who planned the killing. Even a cursory review of that deadly day in Dallas reveals an official narrative shot through with gaping holes. Reaching beyond the bounds of time and space, the remote viewing data reveals chilling new details of a murder that lives on in infamy. Hello and welcome, Courtney, and thank you so much for joining us yet again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greg, I always enjoy coming on to your show. It's a real high-quality interview, so you're one of the best. So I appreciate it, and I'm honored to always be invited back.
Well, I really appreciate those comments, Courtney, and right back at you. Now, today we're going to talk about the Farsight Institute's latest remote viewing project, the JFK Assassination, The Shooters, which is part 1 of the project. At this stage, we normally talk a little bit for the uninitiated about what remote viewing is, but on this occasion, we're going to press on simply because I've spoken to you so many times. If people are completely new to remote viewing, and before listening to this, they want to get the 101 on it, they can do a couple of things. They can go to the Farsight Institute website, go to the navbar, they can find what is remote viewing. If they can go to legalizefreedom.com, they can stick your name, Courtney Brown, into the search section. They can find all the previous interviews we've done, and in each one of those, we break down what remote viewing is. So, in the interest of time, we're going to get straight onto the meat of the matter. I mean, the JFK assassination really is one of the headline conspiracy theories. We'll just use that word because, theory or fact, it's all blurred in this case. And along with the moon landings, later, of course, 9/11, it's just one of the most hotly debated historical events in terms of, what really happened. Before we dive into the remote viewing section of it, from your personal perspective and the perspective of this project, set out the scenario as you see it that was basically tasked, that became the target here, at some of the anomalies in the case that you were hoping to get some answers for.
Actually, as far as I was concerned going into this project, I wasn't buying into any particular viewpoint. I just knew that it was a really big thing. People were wondering how he was shot. And I had seen the so-called Abraham Zapruder film that showed the assassination, and it looks from the film that he was shot from the front and the back, because at one point the government and the official media was saying that it was shot from the back from one lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. And that would mean all the bullets came from behind, but it really looks like in the Zapruder film as if he was smacked by something in the front, like one of the bullets, and that's what blew up his head. The brain came out and the whole thing. And the sort of mainstream academics that were called in to comment on that, and also the mainstream academics that sometimes chimed in, and they're ones that typically appear on some of the mainstream news outlets. Some of the ones that I said that I had heard were saying that the muscle tissue in the back of the neck must have been so traumatized by what happened that it yanked the head backwards. And the only thing I can say is that when you look at the film, it certainly doesn't look like muscle tissue was yanking the head backwards. It looks like the head was thrown backwards enormously by a blast. And so, the idea that the muscle tissue from a brain that would have been dead at that point was doing all that reflexively, that's sort of what we call the mainstream theory. And sort of going into this, the only thing I was thinking was, that film doesn't seem to match what you see, and the muscle of the back doing all that yanking did seem sort of far-fetched. But other than that, I was willing to say, who knows? And so I went in sort of saying, I'll accept anything that happens. And so what we did was I drew up the target for the 9/11. I'm sorry, not for the 9/11, for the JFK assassination. And the target that I decided was the best way to phrase it is the following, and I'll read it to you. The viewer will remote view the assassination of John F. Kennedy as it occurred in Dealey Plaza in Dallas on Friday, November 22nd, 1963. The viewer will perceive the assassination itself in all of its complexity, as well as any preparatory activity immediately prior to the assassination that may be related to the assassination. That's it. So I drew up that as a target. And then I contacted the remote viewers that were participating in this project, which were the great Daz Smith from the UK, and Dick Algier, Hawaii. And they've worked with us with many projects and have a long history, verifiable public history of remote viewing at projects at the Farsight Institute. They've been published in peer-reviewed scientific outlets, the whole thing. And they're really well known, and and I assigned them this target, blind. And now that means they got an email from me saying, there is a target. Remote view it, send me the sessions. That's it. They were not told, they were not told that the target had anything to do with anything. They did not know that it was John F. Kennedy, the assassination, that it was a political element, that it was anything at all. They just said the only thing they got was an email saying there is a target. Remote view it, send me the sessions. And all of their sessions were recorded live on video for all to see. They were alone in their studios when they did it. There was no monitor that could have led them. Nobody knew what the target was except me, and I didn't tell them. So they had to get all of the information themselves using this mental process, remote viewing. And in the past, the last 3 projects we had dealt with extraterrestrial topics, things on Mars, Iapetus, the moon of Saturn, and the Phoenix Lights in Arizona. So, they were not, they did not have anything recent dealing with the assassination stuff. In fact, they had been remote viewing for a long time. They had never been targeted. They had never been given this target the way it was given. So they waited a long time to finally get this target. And they didn't find out what the target was until all of the remote viewing for both of them was completely done, locked and sealed, delivered to me. And then after it was all done, I told them what the target was. And they were amazed as I was, because the interesting thing about people that are of the quality of Daz Smith and Dick Algire is that you really get great data. It's delivered live on video. You don't have to look at pieces of paper and try to figure out what squiggles are. You get really explicit descriptions of what happened. And both of them completely independently on opposite sides of the planet with absolutely unambiguous detail said the exact same thing. They explained everything that was related to what happened in Dealey Plaza on that day. Now, this is the first part of our project, meaning the first part, which was just released on Friday, last Sunday, this past Sunday, was dealing with the shooters, so the people who actually shot John F. Kennedy. And the next part is going to be released on November 22nd of this month, and that's the anniversary of the shooting of John F. Kennedy, and that deals with the people who organized the actual shooting. So these remote viewing data are not like vague, foggy, fuzzy things that can be interpreted a billion ways. These are eyewitness reports done with remote viewing that are more clear. Did you get what I said? More clear than something someone would have seen if they were witnessing it with their own physical eyes on the ground in Dealey Plaza that day. And the reason is the remote viewers, as trained as they are, can flit around. They can say, what's this, what's that, and they can go places and follow what's happening. So they sort of outlined it all themselves. Now, the basic elements they found were exactly the same. Lee Harvey Oswald was nowhere. Well, he was there, but he was not the shooter. And the groups that shot him were extremely well organized. And so the mainstream theory that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone shooter looks like it is completely concocted. And so it has nothing to do with that. So really basically, oh, by the way, I might also say that the Lee Harvey Oswald thing looks like it was a story, a front story used to protect what actually happened. And I can also say that the idea of a conspiracy theory was invented during the John F. Kennedy aftermath, meaning authorities calling people who were questioning what happened, people who were thinking in terms of conspiracy theory, that phrase, conspiracy theory, and conspiracy theorists, that started then. That was when it happened. That's when it started. So that's when they started using that. And they started using that to ridicule people who were questioning the main idea. That was what was going on then, and that that concept of conspiracy theory has lived a long life and is still used to this day whenever anyone questions anything that doesn't match what the official view is. And it's been very successful to block people in the mainstream from questioning these types of things.
Before we dive into the details of the sessions themselves, just a couple of things I want to touch upon. The first of which is, you mentioned the footage that's available, it's out there, of the actual JFK assassination in itself. Unlike 9/11, for example, back then you didn't have this profusion of personal recording devices, so I've always thought it's very significant that some of these historical events, especially controversial ones and violent ones, always seems to be that's made a point that they're actually recorded. But my main thrust of this is that whether it's the footage of the moon landings, whether they happened or not, or whether they happened how they were told they happened, whether it's the JFK assassination, and even with 9/11, when there was so much footage, the footage that's out there is used to prove and disprove the official line, which is interesting. You know, they'll point to, in our case, we're talking about JFK, people will analyse that footage and they will come out and say, according to this footage, here's why it must have happened this way. And others could say, according to this footage, here's why it's impossible that it happened that way. In itself, and it leaves the rest of us just going, to hell with it. You know, people don't know what to think anymore. It's almost like they lose their own critical faculties in the face of this sort of thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. And in fact, the mainstream authorities, governmental authorities and so on, depend on that. They depend on people going crazy and coming up with crazy ideas. They want that type of response. So both having one setup offered to the public that obviously has holes in it, triggering that reaction that's sort of wild and crazy from the audience, that's the whole game. That's the whole thing. Because then when people who are serious about it want to tune into that topic, they see a lot of crazy people sort of, venting all types of anger and saying all types of things. And I deal with that a lot because on our social media that we use, we try to present information dealing with our projects, but, mixed in with all the information dealing with our projects is a huge quantity of stuff that goes like, and this proves that the earth is flat, or that the earth is hollow, or that the Pope is Satan, or that, that minds are really, controlled by radio frequencies. And I mean, it just goes on and on. So it sort of brings all that in. So if people are interested in what we do and they come into the social media, in addition to seeing the actual material that we have, that we've recorded live on video and painstakingly made it really scientific, kept all the controls in there, blind and so on. Instead of just seeing that, they see that mixed in with all these other things. And that's exactly what the authorities want, because that sort of chases sort of serious people away. I have, on the other hand, come to just think that that's the environment. That's what we have to deal with. And so there's an educational process, and it's slowly working. We have a large audience now that listens to what we do and follows what we do, and just sort of knows that sort of crazy element is just sort of background noise that is always present, and you just live with it.
Whether you're doing remote viewing or whether you're an individual non-remote viewer who's just looking at some photographs or some footage, I'm a great advocate of say what you see. It's like, trust your senses unless you've got a reason to doubt them. And that's what I referred to when I mentioned people losing their critical faculty. It's like people will see something. For example, we did a show on 9/11. I don't necessarily want to backtrack on that. People can go and listen to it. But people saw buildings being demolished in a controlled demolition. That's what I see. Because I've seen buildings being demolished in controlled demolitions. There's other possible explanations, but in the same way that you look at the JFK footage and that's a guy being hit by more than one bullet. Don't say what you see. Reality is what we tell you it is. That's the kind of the attitude, isn't it? But my other point I wanted to get to just before we dive into the first session is I always thought that there was a lot of absurdities around JFK scenario. First of all, that they would have the president in an open-top car. People might say, well, it was a more innocent time, and after JFK, of course, presidents didn't travel like that. But I still thought, the institution of president wasn't a new thing. Lincoln was assassinated. You know what I mean? It's not like the idea of somebody gunning for the president was a fresh one. And it was also absurd that any individual that would go after the president in that way, that chances then pulling that off, everything that would be required to be in place, a lone wolf, be very, very difficult to the point of being impossible, especially in that technologically limited time. And the idea that even one person within an organization would attempt that, you would know based on open military and operations, and also on perhaps not open but intelligence operations that subsequently became public after the event. When you see the organization, the number of people, what it takes to put these sort of things together, the idea that it was one guy with a crappy gun, it was not well maintained. And in fact, a lot of people will have seen the 2007 movie Shooter with Mark Wahlberg, and although that doesn't deal specifically with how many gunmen it might take to do something, I think it prompts people to think a lot about this type of scenario and what it takes to bring it together. And that, incidentally, was based on a 1993 book called Point of Impact, which is probably even more interesting. But again, people quite often won't put two and two together. Even though, and another point here is that 60% of the American public believe that there's something suspicious about the JFK assassination, and yet in all, the official line is still that it's settled. We know what happened, everybody's quite happy, and it's only a fringe minority that have got any issue with this.
Actually, it's even more profound than that because, of course, I'm a university professor, and the universities, now, of course, I do not do any of this remote viewing research at the university, but nonetheless, at the universities are extremely good at maintaining the party line, meaning if the government pronounces that it was a lone assassin and that 9/11 was, that a lone assassin shot JFK and that 9/11 was done by a bunch of nitwit Al-Qaeda pilots that were just students, pilot students, and they brought down those buildings, that's what they teach at the universities. And, nowhere in the universities, anywhere in the United States, perhaps the world, do they talk about governmental systems that are not at all the way the textbook would say they are. They still teach the subjects of American politics, for example, in terms of you have the three branches, the judiciary, the legislature, and you have the executive, and they have checks and balances, and that they have external enemies from time to time that gets us into battles, and that's the way it is. But nowhere is it even allowed at the universities, all universities, to talk about a government that has a completely back-end orientation and motivation and set of operations, and that coups d'etats have occurred, and that military engagements are triggered artificially in order to surprise the public, to catch them off guard, so that they will then support a huge military response for something. I mean, that's just simply not taught at the universities. So universities in general, and that includes all of academia, certainly not just my university, but all universities, really support the party line. So if something does happen that is very, very different from the party line, from the mainstream orientation of what happened, that type of information does not get into the classroom, not as something serious. And so, you really have to think of university, and believe it or not, I'm not criticizing the universities, I'm describing the universities. Universities are consolidators of information. That means their job is to consolidate the views as they are most widely accepted in the mainstream, package them into educational units that can be absorbed by students, and then the students learn those units and then graduate with the understanding that they have achieved some level of mastery of those units. So universities are not places that teach radicalized thought, which is things that go against the mainstream. They are not places where you teach creativity. They are places where you teach units of thought. And when people have accepted thought, and so when people get hired as university graduates, the employers are expecting that those people know the background of the established ways of thinking. That's what universities are supposed to do. So now that, again, is not a criticism. You don't even want universities to be hotbeds of radicalized thought. You want them to sort of cover the basics so that people sort of know those basics when they leave. On the other hand, that does leave a huge vacuum in terms of getting people to think outside of the box. That's why, for example, that both Bill Gates and Steve Jobs left the universities. And Steve Jobs' famous case, he just didn't see anything in the universities that was relevant to the revolutionary types of thoughts that he had. And the universities had a compartmentalized way of thinking that he was vehemently opposed to. So he was a revolutionary in thought. And the institution of Apple was very much like a university. And they fired him, and they had to get rid of him. They did not want him. And they only reaccepted him back because they were within a couple months of bankruptcy, and it was a Hail Mary pass to let him come back into Apple. And for 5 years after they brought him back, they kept the title acting president, acting CEO, because they were still frightened of him. It wasn't until years later that they finally dropped the acting and said he was the CEO, and they embraced the idea that Apple was going to be a revolutionary company, at least as long as Steve Jobs was alive. But that was a very rare exception for institutions in general. So universities are like other institutions. They're like businesses. They're like major corporations. They're all institutions, you don't become a huge institution of any type, whether you're IBM, Coca-Cola, whether you're Pepsi, whether you're FedEx, no matter what, you don't become a large business or university by radicalizing and revolutionizing things. You become big by doing something really well, and that something has to be something that's well established. So in terms of universities, they pick up those mainstream ideas and package them into really neat little units and make sure that those students are taught that. That means that the students are not taught revolutionary ways of thinking. They're not taught how to be Steve Jobs. So that comes outside of the university, and so that's not a criticism of the university at all. It means that there is another realm of growth, of maturation, for individuals. And that's where Farsight comes in. Farsight, and for those who are maybe new to what we do, it's www.farsight, like seeing far, FARSIGHT.org, O-R-G. We are a revolutionary company. We are a revolutionary organization. We're a nonprofit. It's a 901, we're an IRS approved 501c3 nonprofit. So, but nonetheless, we're a revolutionary organization, and what we do is we had taken the original military remote viewing procedures, and we experiment. If there's one thing that's known about us is experimentation. We try everything. So we don't say, this is the way the military did it, and we knew Ingo Swann, and we are good disciples of him, and so we say, we've tried this, we've tried that, this is the way we're experimenting with this. We're constantly reinventing the wheel. And so that's really sort of the mark of Farsight. That's our educational role. We have decided to be an educational organization that produces revolutionary thought based on just the facts, no matter what mainstream says, thinks, or accepts.
Well, turning to the first of the two remote viewing sessions in the new documentary, the first done by Daz Smith, based, as you say, here in the UK, as he begins to probe the target, it's interesting to watch how, not necessarily how differently he and Dick work, but just how they get differing but sort of complementary results. And Daz begins to turn up, first of all, the complexity of the situation that he's looking at. And then he notices a lot of motion in the situation, a lot of emotion as well. And of course, we think of the events of that day unfolding. This is exactly what you would expect. And he picks up on the energy in the target area. And this is one thing that's come up again and again with past remote viewing sessions that I've spoken to you about, that the energy of situations is something that is that's just really, really central to the whole thing. Whether positive or negative, it really helps to point the viewers, or guide them, draw them in. Maybe you can find a better way of putting it, but the energy is key. And also, Daz quickly establishes or senses that this is a past event.
Yeah, when the remote viewing starts, and you have to actually see the actual remote viewing itself. That's why we record it live. So when people see that, it's a 2 hour and 20-minute documentary, so you actually see the actual data come in live. So when you see it, they begin with very elementary stuff. They do the probing for the target, and they're picking up things like you said, like energy, directed energy, a lot of emotion at the site. And he slowly starts to piece that together. Now, if we were just trying to produce a PBS-type documentary, like a BBC-type thing or a PBS thing, all that would be cut out. But these documentaries that we do are videos of record, so we are obligated in this stage to leave it all in. So you see them start with these very primitive type of ideas that there's a lot of emotion at this place. What is this thing? And what's this energy coming from? And then if you watch Daz, for example, continue through the session, he eventually finds that there's a road, there's a city, there's a car on the road, and that the energy were bullets that were coming from 2 different locations, including in front of the, and then he follows the energy trails back, the bullets back to where they originated from, and he finds 2 teams of sniper units, where each team had a shooter, an assistant, and an overseer who was looking out for, making sure things were cleaned up afterwards and looking out. And these were not at all like lone gunmen type of things. These were really expert shooter teams. They have done this type of thing before. And so, that type of explicit detail comes after he's exploring all these primitive things, and you get to actually see how they piece it all together until they finally see it. So you end up, if this was like a PBS or a BBC documentary, they'd only show you the end, and you wouldn't know how we got there. But we show the whole thing, so you see how the pieces together, and by showing the whole thing, it becomes riveting, because you know the target, but Daz and Dick did not know the targets, and you see them slowly putting these pieces together, and yes, that's it, and you're sort of rooting for them, and then they slowly put it all together, and finally, it gets to the point where they know a lot more than you ever thought was possible, and your jaw is on the ground, and you say, OMG, I can't believe, an explicit level of detail. And that's what makes it so interesting, because we get stuff. So when we did this JFK assassination, and this first part deals just with the shooters, it was a lesson for me. I honestly did not know. By the way, I did not know at the time that I assigned this thing much about Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm a political scientist. You're sort of saying that's sort of surprising, but I basically had gone along with the mainstream idea. I just said the documentary. I guess if I was going into the interview with anything, it was a question of whether there might have been a second shooter. That was it. But I really wasn't questioning the idea of whether Lee Harvey Oswald was involved in it in some way. And then afterwards, after I got these results, I said, whoa, because I'm the world's greatest, largest, most prolific scholar in the subject of remote viewing as it's done with these military or military-derived methodologies. I can say that because I'm the only scholar that does this, but I certainly have a huge amount of experience working with these types of things. And I trust these data because I know what it is. I mean, somebody else can sort of be new to remote viewing and say, should I believe this? But I've been doing this for a long time, and I trust the remote. I know the quality of these remote viewers. I know what the remote viewing data is supposed to look like. And when this came in, I said, whoa. And that's when I actually started to investigate more about what actually happened with Lee Harvey Oswald. For example, this may seem nutty for a political science professor to not know this, but I'm a mathematician. I can sort of say maybe I focused a little bit too much on math in my education, but I, for example, didn't know about the quality of the Lee Harvey Oswald gun. I mean, I knew that Lee Harvey Oswald was accused of being the lone shooter, and he had a rifle, and it was found at the scene, but I didn't really know much beyond that. And believe it or not, I think if I asked probably 95% of political scientists in the United States, if I asked them about that, that's probably as much as they would know as well. Meaning, we academics, it's amazing at how much we buy into and don't question what was told to us originally. And if that's true of us, then imagine how it's true of almost everybody else. So anyway, I didn't know, for example, that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't have any serious training at all at shooting rifles. Secondly, I didn't know that the rifle that he is accused of having used for the assassination was in extremely bad condition, and that the government's own experts that looked at that rifle said it couldn't be shot with that telescopic lens. They couldn't even aim it properly, and they tried to actually fix the rifle to see if they could get it to aim by putting shims in the telescopic lens to get it to aim properly. Shims, it's S-H-I-M-S. So, and they couldn't fix it. So the rifle was in a really poor, almost rusting condition. The thing could not be aimed properly, and it's almost impossible to think that that rifle could have been used. Secondly, there's a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald holding this rifle, and that was produced as evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald indeed owned that rifle. And I never questioned that, but then after the documentary remote viewing was done, I did a little investigation. I found out that that picture is in heavy dispute. That, in fact, it has all types of evidence suggesting that it was documented. It was a doctored photo. In fact, it was a faked photo. The head is the wrong size. All types of pieces are wrong. And it looks just like it was done on film, but in a darkroom, in a very well-designed, clever set of darkroom stuff. But it was combined and it was faked. They didn't use Photoshop because they didn't have Photoshop back in those days, but the techniques that were available to make a doctored photo are all in evidence in that photo. And so it looks like he, didn't have that photograph with him with the rifle. And so, the other thing that became very clear afterwards was that whoever did shoot Lee Harvey, whoever actually did shoot John F. Kennedy was an absolute expert marksman. He was shot from far away, and the people were, of military-grade sniper quality. I mean, they were good. They hit exactly on the head. They hit the neck exactly. I mean, those bullets didn't miss. They were, and if there's anything I do know, I don't know a lot about guns, but I do know that expert marksmen really keep good care of their guns. They clean them. They make sure they aim properly. They're like race car drivers with their race cars. They take care of their machinery. So the gun that they said was used to shoot JFK, it was in a really bad condition, and it couldn't be aimed properly. It was gunky, dirty, rusty. I mean, it was a bad. No expert marksman would have used that gun, and whoever did shot JFK was an expert marksman. So, I mean, and the discussion about how the gun could not be aimed properly, that's from the government's own forensic expert rifle people that examined. That's actually from the committee hearings. That's, quotes from the committee hearings. The actual gun investigator said, this gun just is in a wreck of a condition. We can't aim it. Nobody can aim it. And we tried to fix it. We couldn't fix it. So that's pretty condemning in terms of that lone gunman stuff, but I really investigated a lot of that after I saw these remote viewing data. So these remote viewing data that honestly your audience really has to see with their own eyes. Don't just listen to the podcast and say, okay, now I know. You have to actually see it with your own eye. That's why we go to the trouble of recording this so you can actually watch it. It's spellbinding to watch it, to actually see it develop. You learn not only about remote viewing and about consciousness and about what can be done in the highest end levels, but you also learn about history. And so one of the reasons we do these projects is not only to teach people through resolving these mysteries about remote viewing, but because the mysteries themselves are so fascinating to be resolved.
It's always these mentally ill kind of, loners with dubious pasts, in and out of either secret programs, or they appear not to have a family, or it's not who they say they are, or they're maybe in and out of mental institutions. It's quite often these types that are put forward as being capable of these amazing feats, just like, those incompetents were in 9/11. If people look at something like the movie The Day of the Jackal, there's a plausible movie that's apparently down to a one shooter working on his own, with instructions and with money, but working on his own, and you watch how meticulous, how ruthless, how intelligent that guy is, and he still fails on his mission. Sorry, spoiler alert, should have mentioned that, but
it's okay. Yeah.
Even though it's fiction, Frederick Forsyth is a guy who's got a background. He's an insider. He'll bring a lot of real knowledge to a story like that. So the idea that these sort of bumbling incompetence with a pea shooter that's going to pull this off. Just doesn't.
Yeah, that's it's amazing that people like in academia don't question this either. I mean, it is, it never ceases to amaze me that first, and I have to throw myself into all of this. There's a lot of people, I want to be quite honest here. There's a lot of people who were upset with me when we came out with the 9/11 project. And the reason they were upset with me is because I told them that I had bought into the mainstream idea that those planes actually brought down the Twin Towers, and I just didn't know what brought down the Building 7, which was right next to the Twin Towers. But people were really upset. Like, how can I be a political scientist and not know that? I mean, that's like so stupid. And I really don't have a good answer for that. It's a real question. I actually ask myself that, but I have to say that's a question that I ask of all of academia. What is it in the intellectual enterprise that makes us so accepting of mainstream ideas? I actually don't know. But anyway, I do know that Farsight Institute is a revolutionary organization, because even though I go into many of these projects sort of accepting mainstream thought, it leads me to throw it out entirely. It leads me to recognize that, in fact, things are much different than we thought. So what we are left with is a situation in which there is a lot of change that happens on the level of the government that is done entirely behind the scenes. For example, with the 9/11 stuff, these remote viewing data that we had for that project clearly indicated that elements, not all of the government, but elements within the government, wanted to initiate a war, probably in Iraq, and they needed a major event in order to do that. The Twin Towers needed to come down. They were damaged from a previous terrorist event. They were filled with asbestos. It would have cost $1 billion to take them down. No one ever thought about how to get them down once you put them up. But they were buildings that needed to come down. And so they had a combination of an intractable problem of having to take the buildings down and also wanting a war. And so they conspired to kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. And the Al-Qaeda people were nitwits that went along for the ride. I'm sure the Al-Qaeda people actually were training to fly those planes into the buildings. And I'm sure also that the governmental elements that were watching all of that happen from the very beginning to the end, their greatest fear is that the Al-Qaeda people wouldn't be able to fly the planes well enough to hit the buildings. And so, that led to all types of stuff, including the remote viewing data that we found that at least one, perhaps all of the planes were controlled by what we now call, it's a form of remote control that locks everything out, and it's in most of the airliners today, and basically what it is, it's a method of stopping terrorists from taking over a plane so that they can lock it out and fly the plane from control towers. Anyway, that type of machinery was available to the Defense Department when the 9/11 thing happened, although it wasn't available for public stuff. It did become available for public stuff after December 2006. Anyway, it's a type of thing called uninterruptible autopilot. So but you have a whole events being orchestrated, and that the public being sort of led by sheep, sort of by having explosions. Let's say you have a whole bunch of sheep and consider the sheep the public, and the authorities say we have to move this herd of sheep, this flock of sheep. We have to move them in that direction. How are you going to do it? And so they have a big explosion off to the left, and that makes all the sheep run to the right, and that's how they get their stuff. So with the 9/11 stuff, that's what they had. They had an event happen, and for good measure, they had a bombing of the Pentagon. So they could that diverted attention from the idea of an inside job, because why would we bomb ourselves, type of a thing. And then there's all types of complexities involved with it, and all of those are, sort of dealt with. And so with regard to and that's again in the 9/11 project, and I went into that 9/11 project totally accepting and believing the mainstream idea that those planes brought down the buildings. And I sort of woke up from that by looking at the data, and then I sort of pieced it all together. And then I found out there was a huge cottage industry of architects, engineers, and so on, who said what we were told in the mainstream simply isn't possible. Those buildings could not have come down from those planes. Building 7 was clearly a controlled demolition. And these are very important architects and engineers who are saying this stuff. And that there's pilots organizations with like a few thousand people in it saying a jumbo jet could not have been the thing that hit the Pentagon, because you can't fly a jumbo jet like that thing flew. It's just impossible. No pilot is good enough to do what that thing did. Only a small cruise missile can do that. And things like there are no wings, and whatever hit the Pentagon, there were no wings on it. I mean, all types of things like that. But people don't ask those questions. So these experts, these pilot organizations, I'm talking, big pilot, airline pilots, things like that, big pilot organizations and architects and engineers, very mainstream architects and engineers, people in the masses don't even listen to those people. They just accept the mainstream ideas, including me before the Farsight Institute did that project. Same thing with the JFK thing. We go in assuming that most of what the government said was correct. But in reality, it's very clear from these remote viewing data that there were elements within the government that simply wanted JFK, for whatever reason, to go. He was causing too much change too quickly, uncontrollable. He was threatening the so-called powers that be. And, and they said he just simply had to go. Now, in the next documentary that we come out with, we show who actually was that did that. But, in this one, they really had to get rid of John F. Kennedy, and it was assumed from the beginning that they were going to have somebody caught. Meaning, if nobody was caught, you just can't shoot a president and then say, oh, and we never found the guy who did it. That would have produced a huge uproar in the people. So there had to have been someone who did it. The identifying of Lee Harvey Oswald must have been something that was orchestrated from the very beginning. At any rate, what we got was 2 separate teams of expert shooters working in a coordinated way, but independently in different locations. There were other people on the ground and other people in spotter locations, such as on top of the old courthouse, which looks like a Gothic building, that were sort of, overviewing, overseeing, absolutely. There was a lot of people in that plaza. There were a lot of people in that plaza that were involved.
Well, turning to part 2 of the remote viewing sessions for the JFK project, which was Dick Allgire's session. As I mentioned earlier, there's some overlap with Daz's information, as you'd expect. There are some key differences, which makes it very interesting. And the first thing that Dick really zooms in on is buildings and the kind of layout of this place that he perceives. And the old courthouse that's there I don't know if it's actually on Dealey Plaza, but it's certainly just, where this assassination took place. He becomes very fixated on that, and that's very key because it's not random that it's just he perceives this building there. As he goes into his session, it becomes very important in how the events of that day unfold as Dick perceives them. Yeah, that's what he calls the old Gothic building. And when he first saw it, in his remote viewing sessions, he thought he was dealing with some target in like the Middle Ages or something like that, because it does look like a castle type building out of that realm. And then he kept on describing it. Then he realized it was an old Gothic looking building, but it wasn't in the Middle Ages. It was in the very recent past, and he put it all together, and that he came up with an absolutely spot on, perfect description of the old courthouse, which is right on Dealey Plaza. So for anybody who wonders whether remote viewing actually works, you have to look at Dick Allgire's session for the JFK assassination, because right then and there it is absolutely clear. That was such an absolutely unambiguous element that was right at the target, that was described so perfectly. So that was a real good verifiable element. So anyone who's wondering, could this be real, look at his descriptions of the old courthouse building and then say, wow, that's pretty amazing. And that brings much more credibility to the rest of the data dealing with the JFK assassination. Well, I've had skeptics say to me, and this will sound like absolute nonsense to you, Courtney, but I'm just addressing it to people who are listening to this who may be skeptics. Well, given what we know, I mean, someone like Dick or you or Daz or whoever, you can look at what we now understand, what we now know about certain scenarios, and you can get up in front of a whiteboard and you can draw things and you can put your fingers to your temples and pretend, I could do that, Courtney. Do you know what I mean? I could do that and I could make a little film of myself. Anybody could do this and it will be complete nonsense. But remote viewing, if people study it, is a real and verifiable phenomenon. So yes, it could all just be made up in the light of what we know of history, but what on earth would be the point of doing that? If you see what I mean.
Well, it's more than that. That's why this building that you mentioned is so valuable, because nobody could describe in such detail such a very unusual building with such accuracy, unless it was that the remote viewing actually was happening. Remember, he knew nothing about the target. He was in Hawaii. I'm in Atlanta. Daz Smith is in the UK. Everybody's separated by, a large part of the planet. He did it totally solo. All data for the project was done totally solo. There was no one else in the room, and he came up with a perfect description of this building, and he located exactly where it is in Dealey Plaza. And this is not just a random building with 4 walls. I mean, this is a unique architecture, and he described it as if he was tracing the building with the turrets and all the other crazy things that come out of it, with tracing paper on top of a photograph. I mean, it was unbelievably accurate. So for those people who say this is all made up, you have to look at them and say, how the heck do you make up that? And so then you say, well, if the remote viewing is real, then what else? So the thing is, it's not easy for humans to do remote viewing, and it's certainly not easy for humans to do remote viewing at the level that you see with Daz Smith and Dick Allgire. But it can be done with enough dedication, enough training, enough, emphasis put into the process in your life so that it becomes a big deal. Yeah, it can be done. And when it is done, it is literally awe-inspiring. And that's what we have with this assassination. So if you're going to have your doubts, at least watch the documentary first and then have your doubts. But the documentary itself will knock most of the doubts away. That's why we record it live on video. We were having a very difficult time convincing people, especially skeptics, by just showing them pieces of paper with sketches on them. What changed the game is us recording the whole session live on video. And that is amazing.
It was interesting at the start of Dick's session. You're there in the room with him, and he's already sketched something out on his whiteboard. And it's just, a sort of a scene. There's grass, and there appears to be rodents and buildings in the distance. And he explains getting this sort of gestalt view of something, and when he remote views, and then he's trying to recall it to get it down on the board so that so that you and I can see it. I mean, it's in his mind, but in order to share it with us and not just a verbal description. And I guess that was a good insight into some of the, I want to say problems. I think maybe a better word is challenges in remote viewing. In that, if you can imagine, like for example, maybe I'll have a dream at night, and I might have a very vivid scene in a dream, and I might wake up, and this has certainly happened to me before, I don't know about you, and you're trying to describe the dream maybe to your significant other or to a friend later on, and you find that you're struggling to actually get everything down before the details are lost, and because it's like a flash snapshot, it's like going into a darkened room, and then someone sets off a photographic flash, and in that flash you see the room, and then it's gone, and then your brain is scrambling to recall everything.
Yeah, that's what dreams happen, and that's what remote viewing is like as well. You get these flashes of images, and you have to remember them and bring them back. The good thing about doing this long enough in remote viewing is you get to the point where you can hold on to those images. It's not like they don't go away. You can focus on them and hold on to them, and they start out being foggy and vague and stuff, but they clear up as the remote viewing session goes on. And then it's like the remote viewer is there and looking at everything. And the remote viewer has his or her eyes open, and so you're looking at the stuff in the room, but they're basically ignoring that stuff, and they're focusing on these mental images really closely. And at that point, the data flow in so quickly. Now, that's one of the other good reasons why we went to video. When we were dealing with paper and pen, the viewers couldn't record the information quick enough. So when you're dealing with video, they're there viscerally at the target, and they're able to speak as fast as they want. They can just talk about what's there and then draw sketches of things they're seeing. So it really is a much better way to present remote viewing to an audience that's new to remote viewing. You don't really have to know much about remote viewing to watch a video session of the process and say, oh, I get it. Yeah, so anyway, this is part one of the documentary, which really resolves the issue, as far as I am concerned, with these remote viewing data, as to who actually shot JFK. It was not a lone gunman with a crappy rifle that couldn't even be aimed properly. It was 2+ teams. I say 2+ because there apparently were 2 separate teams of 3 people each, combined with a whole host of other support personnel surrounding that carried out this assassination and cleaned up everything afterwards. And part of the process was obviously to make sure that a particular person was pegged as the assassin. And you'll see much more of this in the follow-up that we're going to do in part 2, where we talk about the organization and how the actual JFK assassination was pulled off. The actual organization, who did it, how it was organized, the meetings, that's absolutely fascinating, because this was not just done on the spur of the moment. This had to be pulled off with exceptional care. And because you don't just shoot the president and then say, well, that's the end of it. If somebody's going to shoot the president, there has to be a full backstory that's developed to give to people. Just like with the 9/11 stuff. If you bring down the Twin Towers and bomb the Pentagon, you have to have a backstory. Actually, the bombing of the Pentagon looks like it was part of the backstory. But you have to have a backstory that fills in the details so the public will be convinced that, your story of how this happened actually happened. So that's part of the game. By the way, I should mention, Greg, that this has been a known phenomenon in political science research for a very long time. For example, when Bismarck wanted Napoleon III, that's Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew who was running France, when he wanted Napoleon to invade the German principalities, and Bismarck wanted that because the German principalities were these little Germanic states all separated, and he wanted them to unify into a single German nation. And the only way to do that was to have them attacked by a foreign power that would threaten them, and then they'd join together. So Bismarck, there was a telegram that was sent from King Wilhelm, he was running Prussia at the time, appeasing Napoleon and saying, don't worry, everything's cool, we're all right. And Bismarck stole that telegram, forged a new one that basically gave Napoleon the bird. He said, blankety blank off. Yeah, we'll do whatever we want. Napoleon got outraged and attacked, as predicted, and Bismarck then got what he wanted. All the Germanic states said, what did we do? We didn't do anything. And they met together, they had a congress, they formed the German nation, and they defeated Napoleon, eventually captured Paris. So, having these events happen, triggering these events is old. It's very old. And in fact, with World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew full well that there was going to be an attack in the Pacific. Now, people who are, saying this is crazy stuff, this is Courtney going up in conspiracy theories, you just don't know your history. Turner Catledge, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, is on video recording. You can see it on YouTube. There's 2 videos called Hail to the Chief and Manipulator-in-Chief. He was a close confidant of Roosevelt. Roosevelt told him. And you see Turner Catledge, the former editor-in-chief of the New York Times, saying exactly what happened. That Roosevelt knew there was going to be an attack in the Pacific. Churchill was begging him when they met on a battleship in the North Atlantic. Churchill was begging him to enter the war, that the Nazis were attacking Britain, that they were bombing Britain, it was a bad thing, that the U.S. needed to enter the war. And Roosevelt said, I'm not going to enter the war the way Woodrow Wilson entered World War I, with domestic opposition to fighting the war. There is going to be an incident in the Pacific, and it's going to be big, and we're going to wait for it. And when that happens, all domestic opposition will be blown away, and I'll be able to declare war on both Japan as well as Germany. Now, Roosevelt really wasn't worried too much about Japan. It was the Nazis in Germany. He knew that they are the ones that had to be defeated, but he wasn't going to get that unless he waited for the Japanese to attack first. So he was waiting for that to happen first. And you can hear Turner Catledge talk about it yourself. So people who say that, Roosevelt was caught off guard when he said, this is a day that will live in infamy, that's just not what happened. But that's not, by the way, that's not taught at the university level either, believe it or not. Even though it is available to the public, that Turner Catledge video recordings, he's a respected guy. I mean, editor-in-chief of the New York Times. Even though that's available, it's still taught at the high school system and at the university system that the attack on Pearl Harbor was a complete surprise. We were taken totally off guard. But that's not the way government works. And so government works by having events that shock the public into action. And the leaders have to create those events, or let those events happen, or encourage those events. According to Turner Catledge, Roosevelt was actually begging it on. He wanted it to happen. That event had to happen because we needed to enter the war in Europe. And I should also say that the whole idea of having an event trigger our entry into World War into World War II, should be understood in the context of the times. At that time, you had people like Joseph Kennedy. He was the former U.S. ambassador to Britain. He was vitriolically anti-British. He was, he was a very loud noise back in those days. And not just him, there were a zillion other people who were screaming at the top of their lungs, we must not get in war. Let involved in Europe's war. Let Europe fight its own wars. I mean, it was a huge element in the politics of those days. If Roosevelt entered the war in Europe, which he knew he had to do, he would have had a mess, a real mess in the United States, trying to defend the entire generation of the war industry. I mean, the whole country had to be reoriented to fighting the Nazis. And he would have had a battle on both sides, and it would have really hampered the war effort. So, you know, you have to understand that back in those days, domestic opposition to a war that Roosevelt felt was necessary to fight really was an issue. And having the incident in the Pacific, as Turner Catledge likes to talk about it, was really a necessary ingredient to defeating the Nazis. You had to have that sort of manipulation of the mass public. And then, of course, you get things like with the Vietnam War, you had the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It was the first one against the USS Maddox, was a torpedo boat, North Korean, that made essentially no damage at all to the USS Maddox, never got very close. And, you know, that was a big deal that they made in Congress about it. And then 2 days later, they said another incident happened that attacked directly the USS Maddox. It turned out later that the first incident was very minor, that unlike what the Congress was told, and that the second incident was a total fabrication. It didn't happen at all. And this is not an historical dispute, that the second incident against the USS Maddox simply did not occur. But Johnson went to the Congress and said, "This is outrageous. We must be able to defend our troops. We are being attacked without provocation." I mean, we were right in North Vietnamese waters, but nonetheless, he said, "We are being attacked without provocation, and we must be able to defend it." And so Congress was then pushed into signing passing the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which allowed Johnson to do whatever he wanted militarily in in Vietnam. So that's what escalated the Vietnamese War into a huge war. And again, that was an incident that was generated in whole cloth. And the only question that remains historically with that incident is whether Johnson knew he was lying to Congress when he spoke to them. That is still in historical dispute. But the fact that it was a lie, that the incident didn't happen, that's not in historical dispute. So, you know, so this is very common for this type of thing to happen. So if the government wants something to happen, they do it behind the scenes and then come up with a backstory. And that looks like what happened with the JFK assassination. But truly, I do recommend your listeners to watch the actual sessions themselves. Don't just take it at face value that you heard Courtney Brown talk on the web about this thing, or you heard one of the remote viewers give an interview about this thing. You've got to see it with your own eyes in order to understand history and understand how governance actually works in the modern age.
Just a couple of brief points about Dick's session. Could you briefly say something about other senses beyond sight in remote viewing? Because Dick talks about smells. It's quite funny. He mentioned smelling Vitalis hair tonic. And this is something I remember my granddad having in his bathroom cabinet. And as soon as he said that, I thought, yeah, it's 1960s, isn't it? And he also said, I can smell a horse. And maybe that was mounted police, I don't know. And then he also talks about hearing gunshots and screams. So obviously there's more than one dimension to a remote viewing experience.
Actually, that's very important. Everybody back in those days wore Vitalis. That was the grease that everybody put in their hair back in those days. And it had a distinct smell to it. It was in every man's closet. And that he found it was a really great sign, because that did identify the time period that this happened. And yeah, there were people on horseback, police on horseback at the area. I mean, so that all that stuff was there. So yes, remote viewing uses all of the five senses of hearing, touch, sight, taste, and smell. However, it goes beyond that. So it can perceive things that are not accessible to the five senses, such as where did this bullet come from, and it traces it back. So you sort of say, so when you perceive things outside of the five senses, you nonetheless, when you get to where you are and you're doing stuff, you can access all of the five senses. So we normally use the five senses to describe what we find there, to make sense of it to a physical reality that we live in here. But the remote viewing itself goes beyond the body. Clearly, we're not using the hearing, touch, sight, taste, and smell of the physical body in order to do that, but we're translating the perceptions that we get with remote viewing to the five senses to make it understandable to the physical reality that we live in.
And one other point was that towards the end of Dick's session, you can see it, he's kind of the pennies beginning to drop or the cogs are going in his mind, and he says, "Is this the fucking Kennedy assassination?" You know? Yeah. And I wondered at that point, given that you can say how the session in its entirety worked, but I'm thinking now about then exploring who was behind all of this. This was all presumably conducted in one big session?
No.
Okay.
That's it. See, so what happens with part 2, which we're coming out with on November 22nd, which is the anniversary of the assassination, is a separate target that they explored, and that they did not know what that target was about either. So when they went into that target, it was like, well, this is something completely new. And in fact, when they landed on that target, it's like a fairy, you know, like when you're a kid and you're told there are good fairies and they fly in through the window and land on the bed sheets. Well, remote viewing is sort of like that. When they landed on that target, they saw something completely different. They saw like meetings going on, and they followed people into buildings, and they saw the meetings and who was in the meetings and what they were talking about and stuff like that. So they did not know that that next target dealt with the JFK assassination. So what we do is when we have these separate videos come out, typically what we do is we have completely separate targets for each video. So for everything that you see in the current video, which is available now as a video on demand through Vimeo, and it's also going to be coming out in about a week as a DVD for people who like that format. So what you see in that video is about the shooters. So that was a separate target. That was the assassination itself in Dealey's Plaza in Dallas, Texas on that day. What actually happened on the ground right then. The next video that's coming out with is the stuff that happened before that, when the meetings took place of who actually orchestrated this whole thing. Well, separate targets. And then we do that on purpose so that when they go, if they knew that the second target was related to the first one, it gets everything all messed up.
Well, anticipating part 2 of this project, I think it's interesting that when looking at some of the protagonists on the day of the assassination, that Dick uses the phrase, I'm quoting here, above the president. So that's kind of perhaps a little bit of a teaser for us. Just a closing thought, Courtney, in general about these, events that get labelled or get tagged as conspiracies, and the people who explore them, conspiracy theorists, like the moon landings I mentioned before, 9/11, and for people who were alive when JFK was assassinated, people tend to remember where they were at the time.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like there's a mass, these events tend to serve multiple purposes. You mentioned before, with a flock of sheep, you want them to go to the right, you put the sheepdog on the left, that type of thing. And these events have a mass psychological impact. And 9/11 was archetypal of that in the modern communications age. JFK, moon landings, much farther in the past. Even Pearl Harbor, even further back, people might have heard about that days after it happened. But maybe just read about it in the newspaper. And there's a sort of psyop element to all this. And I don't know what you think, but I'm convinced that these events, if not designed to operate on multiple levels, if functionally they do. It's not just a matter of assassinating a president. There's more to it than that.
It's sort of related to the so-called 100 monkey effect, which is once you trigger enough things to happen, does it have a life of itself? And that sort of changes the whole psyche of a country, the whole public. Deviating from that collective psychic accepted view is extremely difficult. Having dissent from that is extremely difficult. This is a very well established result in sociology where they study dissenters, people who dissent from sort of an accepted view within a group or within a social setting. And those dissenters go through hell. It is really not very easy. The social tugs to pull people into line to accept mainstream views of things are enormously powerful. This is a very well-known effect in sociology, and there is no way to overstate the power of that conformity. I've actually written a dissertation on that subject, mathematically modeling. I'm a mathematician, so I modeled sort of some of the dynamics of consent and dissent within group settings, and the power of that is enormous. So when people raise ideas like 9/11 was an inside event, that JFK was a coup d'etat, it's to be expected from a sociological point of view that this is going to run into a brick wall in terms of the mainstream, because to challenge those mainstream ideas is just, it's enormously difficult. And so once a sort of a psychic as well as just intellectual mainstream accepted knowledge element passes a certain level, it's really difficult. But on the other hand, society cannot change. It cannot grow. It cannot improve unless somebody does it, unless somebody raises these issues and constantly hammers away at a wall. That wall, however powerful it may seem, all walls can be broken down. You can chip away at them and they all eventually collapse. Look at the whole idea of believing that the earth was flat. It eventually collapsed. Look at the idea that Copernicus said that, hey guys, Earth is not in the center and all those things don't revolve around the Earth, but we're actually, the sun is in the center and we're revolving around the sun. That was widely laughed at this day, and that was before Newtonian physics came about. People didn't understand. So people were saying, Copernicus, this is so blankety-blank crazy. I mean, why can you even say that? Wake up in the morning, take a look. You can see the sun. It's going from one side of the sky to the next. It's obviously moving. Just take a look at it, you jerk. And this is before we understood anything dealing with Newtonian physics with regard to momentum. So we didn't understand that if we saw something moving, it didn't mean that it's moving. It just, and we wouldn't feel it. People were saying, look, if we were flying around the sun, we would feel it. We're not flying around. Just take a look. Everything's stable here. We're obviously settled. So, breaking that took an enormous amount of effort. And finally, when Galileo did his observations and confirmed what Copernicus had said, he was put in house arrest for 8 years. And it took how many 200, 350 years for the Catholic Church to accept they made a mistake. I mean, the amount of pressure to produce conformity on issues that are just seemingly so obvious in retrospect should never be underestimated, or should never be how should I say it? Should never be overestimated, or underestimated, whatever. It's bigger than you think.
Courtney, today we've been talking about the Farsight Institute's latest remote viewing project. That's JFK Assassination, as mentioned as part 1, The Shooters, part 2 coming up, as you mentioned. Just throw the website out there again, because that's where people can get all this information. And
www.farsight, Farsight, like seeing far, .org, because we're a nonprofit. And if you go there, the big banner right at the top is a JFK Assassination. Click on that. You get to the page where the trailer is there and links to Vimeo. And in about a week or so, there'll be the DVD will be out. So people who like that format can buy that through Amazon. But for right now, it's available instantly as a really high-quality video on demand from Vimeo.
Splendid. Well, Courtney, thank you once again for joining us here on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thank you, Greg. It's always a great pleasure being on your show. You really are a high-class interviewer, so I appreciate being invited.
Thank you, Courtney.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalisefreedom.com. That's legalise-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalisefreedom.com.